We thought it was important for this series of conversations that we're calling Claiming the Beloved Community to include some education. Oh, great, beautiful. We can go to the next slide. Beautiful. To include some key concepts and terms for talking about race and how it operates in our society. And our hope is that you'll consider these concepts and ideas and language for the conversations you'll have in your circles this evening. Tonight we're going to present just three concepts that come out of the work of Visions Incorporated, which is an organization in Roxbury, Massachusetts. Next slide. And Dr. John Powell, who teaches at UC Berkeley and is a director there with the Haas Institute for a fair and inclusive society. So, a few key terms. Next slide. We're going to talk about 4 levels of change and analysis. We're going to talk about implicit bias, and we're going to talk about structural racialization tonight. So 4 levels of analysis. Next slide. So there are 4 levels at which we can talk about, analyze, and understand how the oppression of difference operates in our lived experiences. This is true for a number of categories of difference. You can talk about sexual orientation this way. You can talk about abilities in this way. You could talk about immigration status or language. You could talk about gender in this way. But for our discussion tonight, we're focusing on race and how it operates at personal, interpersonal, institutional, and cultural levels. So the personal, next slide. Personal is about the values, beliefs, and feelings at work inside of our own minds. Our biases, both conscious and unconscious. Next slide. Interpersonal examines the ways that we interact with one another, the way that we behave with one another in our relationships. Next slide. The institutional level takes a look at how the impact of the rules, practices, policies, and procedures of our institutions like our school systems, our justice systems, our law enforcement systems, even our religious systems, amen? And then lastly, the cultural level is how we look at how all of these previous levels, the personal, the interpersonal, and the institutional, shape the broader and sort of unseen and unwritten rules about what's beautiful, about what's true, about what's right, about who belongs. So as it relates to race, I like to summarize this 4 levels analysis in this way. I like to say that racism still lives like an unseen spiritual force. It is in the cultural atmosphere and it's in our psyches. It impacts our thoughts, our assumptions, and our behaviors, the quality of our relationships and our interactions with others, the policies and practices of our institutions, and even our culture's sense of what is right and true, what is beautiful, and who really belongs. In ways both explicit and implicit, we communicate to one another whether we really belong in our communities, really belong in our institutions, really belong in our public spaces. And what young people across the country have been talking about for the past several months is that in their experience, they are being told by their communities that they do not belong. 4 levels at which we can talk about race tonight. So there are 2 more concepts I want us to talk about to hold along with this 4 levels analysis. And those 2 terms are implicit bias and structural racialization. So implicit bias, or unconscious bias, is about the associations, both positive and negative, that we hold about particular people or people groups. These biases are expressed automatically without even our conscious awareness. Science is showing us, and neuroscientists are studying about how very little access we have to our own automatic cognition. Studies on implicit bias have shown that people who explicitly intend to be inclusive and welcoming can hold unconscious biases that impact their interactions with others. So this is mostly a personal and interpersonal level concept, this implicit bias. And this frame has been important in the movement to heal relationships between law enforcement and communities, because it considers how even well-intentioned people in communities can act on associations without fully knowing. And the good news is that science also says that we can retrain our own minds and unlearn our biases. Amen? Structural racialization, last concept. It's what some of us call structural racism. But racialization considers the process of how the rules, practices, policies, procedures, customs, and other institutional arrangements sort of conspire together to create, maintain, and reflect racialized outcomes. The basic point here is that racialized outcomes, like disparities in health or disparities in academic achievement, do not require racist individuals to produce that outcome. So when a so-called race-neutral policy still results in disparities that are racialized, this is what we call structural racialization. This is mostly the level that's at the institutional and cultural level. It helps us examine and understand what might be happening in our communities and institutions without having to prove that an individual person is a racist, although in some cases she or he may be. It lets us see how our systems operate in ways that are largely invisible to us. It lets us understand why we're so surprised that we still have to have this conversation in 2015. Now, we don't have time to dig into deeper ideas, and I'd love to start preaching now. But we invite you to try on the ideas that were just presented around the 4 levels, implicit bias, and structural racialization. So there's some questions we want you to consider. Next slide. In your conversation. Which levels of racism are being expressed in our conversations tonight? When you hear the people give testimony, when you talk in your circles, which levels of racism are you hearing expressed? Is it personal? Is it interpersonal? Is it institutional? Is it cultural or structural? Next question would be to consider, next slide, would be how do the concepts of implicit bias and structural racialization help us understand and even change the relationship between law enforcement and the community? These are the questions that we want you to consider as you're having your conversations together, and we hope these frames help us develop a common language in this series of conversations that we're having today. So on your handout, and like I said before, on the last slide is a link to the Google Drive folder where you can get this presentation, this handout, a glossary of additional terms that you can read on your own in your religious communities and in your organizations. My grandparents used to sing an old spiritual that we're going to sing at the end of our time today, and it's called Come and Go to That Land. And I always knew they were singing about the afterlife, about life after this life. But I learned over time that as participants in the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the Midwest, they were also singing about a real world, our lived world, this world on this side of heaven, and the kind of dreams they had for their children and their grandchildren. They wanted to go to a land where true freedom and citizenship would be realized. They wanted to go to a land where all lives would matter. And I'd like to believe tonight that because we all returned and even brought more friends tonight, that we see ourselves on a journey to that land. Amen? The land of the beloved community. So my prayer is that we will claim that vision tonight in our conversations, and I thank you for your time.